So my talk is called In an Age of Hyperabundance, Curating Photography in an Age of Hyperabundance. By contrast to the almost exclusively handmade, singular analogical objects in emanations surrounding us, contemporary photographic production largely appears ephemeral, bound for temporary circulation as digital data. This exhibition, Emanations, includes various images from the 19th century. Today, more photographs are reportedly taken every 2 minutes than were taken during that entire century. At last count, 350 million pictures are uploaded daily on Facebook alone. Many more are shared, of course, on other platforms such as Instagram, Snapchat, Flickr and Twitter, to mention only those that I know about, those that are dominant in the West. I hardly need to cite more statistics. Photographic images are simply more ubiquitous than ever before, circulating and recirculating online. They're not immaterial, of course. Note the extraordinary server infrastructures that support so-called cloud-based practices, including photo sharing. Nevertheless, photographic images seem to have become variable objects facing unpredictable afterlives. We might question some of the apocalyptic-sounding discourse of flood and saturation, only in the sense that we've heard that many times before. We have to question how new the feeling of overload really is. After all, each generation seems to feel overwhelmed by the number of images. Back in 1927, Siegfried Kracauer famously feared that the onslaught of images in the illustrated press was preventing a real understanding of the world. Susan Sontag, just to take 2 moments, Susan Sontag famously in the 70s called for an ecology of images at the end of her book on photography. So in this paper, I want to use the term hyperabundance, or try to use it without value judgment. I'm simply interested really in what galleries, museums, and of course artists can do with all these images, since it's abundantly clear that museums and galleries, for instance, can't possibly collect, even if they wanted to, or exhibit even the smallest fraction of photographic images produced today. As I'm sure you can't read this, but this is the biggest copy of this image I could get, sorry. Oh, you can, it's a very good projector. Of course, we're in beautiful surrounds. It's better than on my laptop. Well, what we're seeing here is 2011 data. Now, I'm not sure who counts this kind of thing, but Facebook archive versus in this tiniest corner on the left, the bottom left, the Library of Congress image archive, the size, relative size, and the others are like, what is it? Instagram and Flickr. Instagram's probably bigger now. Okay, so in this context of hyperabundance, the curating of photography has arguably become more important if we understand the work of curating to include the identification of work that reflects contemporary experience and warrants historical preservation. But it's also more difficult. For a start, most photographs today are not made to be displayed on anything other than a glowing computer screen or iPhone or laptop, or TV monitor if we're lucky, and hence the irony, of course, of the sort of famous Apple billboards that promote being shot on the iPhone, given that virtually nobody prints out their images anymore. And this is a kind of unrealised potential, if you like. But large-scale images, this is, train of thought here, large-scale images have, of course, been one of the clearest paths for the photographic image into the museum and gallery, marking off an artist's work as more significant than the massive images produced beyond. And this has a long history into the 19th century, which I can't possibly articulate here, but Olivier Lugon has recently written a nice paper in which he points to the enlargement as a kind of key issue for early photographers that sought to conquer the spheres of the salon and the art gallery, and the first solar enlargers appearing as early as the 1850s, after which then there were artificial light projectors that borrowed from magic lantern technology. And as he points out, there's a nice link then between sort of entertainment and spectacle and the first sort of enlarged art images. And of course the importance of larger images grew with pictorialism in the late 19th century. Pictorialists, of course, specialising in difficult printing processes. And in our time, just to leap more towards the present, we've seen, of course, the rising prominence of large-scale colour photography as art, enabled by new printing technologies since the 70s, but particularly into, of course, the 90s and noughties, delivering what the art critic Michael Fried, in his very problematic book, Why Photography Matters as Art as Never Before, in 2008 this came out, he goes so far as to argue that this new form of the picture reinvents the Western pictorial tradition. And he's talking, of course, about people like Jeff Wall, Andreas Gursky and so on. And by contrast, however, Gursky there, by contrast, the British Marxist art historian Julian Stallabrass dubs the work of Jeff Wall and Andreas Gursky and others as museum photography quite dismissively. He sees it as a kind of implicitly conservative form, which is possibly also a fairly blunt argument, but precisely for these reasons of scale. And he argues that, quote, museums wishing to broaden the social composition of their audiences are attracted to this easily legible large-scale photography that deals with familiar contemporary social issues, particularly if it comes complete with references to painting and art history, which of course is a little dig at Jeff Wall from him. Stallabrass is particularly sceptical of Jeff Wall's light boxes, which he sees as serving a utility for the museum in providing a spectacle that has to be seen in the flesh as a physical object in a physical space to get its full effect. Now, for Stallabrass, such images represent an escapist flight from the messy reality of visual culture. I just want a quote from him. He says, "The reality of democratic image culture is hardly to be found in this broadcast model of the museum with its expert discourse guarded by copyright, but with all the imperfections in the postings of images and dialogue that they elicit on YouTube and Flickr." So he, which is quite odd for an art historian, is kind of celebrating the messy, what he calls democratic image culture of online photography, essentially against Jeff Wall. What Wall's lightboxes offer, among other things, is a kind of path for the gallery or museum, namely to focus on the image as an object. But of course, the museum has always focused on objects, as has the art market, while photography's place in the museum, the collecting museum, has, of course, always been quite unstable here. It's often talked about sort of ambiguous status between being an object and information in museums that sort of often threaten museums' conventional hierarchies and collection policies. Jeffrey Batchen, I don't know if I should call you Jeff or just Batchen in this paper, or just Doctor, maybe, the Doctor. And people like Elizabeth Edwards have argued for many years photographic prints are not just two-dimensional images, but are in fact three-dimensional things, photo objects even, have been described as, that lead to, particularly in vernacular forms of photography, embodied interactions, they gather their own histories over time and so on. So these, sometimes dubbed photomaterialists, if you like, reinvest photographs with a kind of aura. Now, it's no accident, to come back to my real topic, that this material tendency in thinking about the photographic image coincides with the rise of digital photography. Coded simulacra induce a longing for the sensually palpable, one writer nicely puts it. The material tendency also finds a strong current in contemporary art photography, or artists using photography, that to some extent, again, are not new, but update earlier interests, revisit certain earlier moments, while this exhibition, Photography into Sculpture, which was curated by Peter Bunnell at the Museum of Modern Art in New York in 1970, was a kind of anomaly in the period of John Sarkowski's famous kind of, focus on optical description, modernist, two-dimensional prints. This exhibition of photography becoming three-dimensional may not have had much impact at the time, but it's recently been sort of in a sense rediscovered. It got restaged even a few years ago, and many of the work now seems, to have a lot of resonance for contemporary artists working with photography in this sort of, this was described as a survey, this show of photographically formed images used in a sculptural or fully dimensional manner. There has, of course, been a recent return to MoMA of such work. I say to MoMA, to other spaces as well, obviously including in this exhibition. There's a Walid Beheshti in this exhibition of Jeff's. These, have been quite prominently seen in sort of the new photography shows at MoMA and so on. And these, very well-known sort of figures who've been shown here in the last few, shown in New York in the last few years, many of them utilise this sort of, bring attention to the materiality of the presentation, the object status. I'm not going to speak about, and this is this quite well-known Crash series of Brendan Fowler's, where he combines up to 4 framed pictures. He calls them crashing them together. And I think we have to see a lot of this in terms of digital hyperabundance and our, of course, access to photographic images on screens. I think that this phenomenon, contemporary phenomenon of artists and curators stressing a photograph's physical presence has to be understood as a kind of riposte to the ubiquity of the digital image. In fact, the current exhibition, Emanations, can also be understood in part, definitely in part, in terms of its focus on the unique photo object. In his wonderful essay, Jeff Batchen, doctor, repeatedly underlines this point that photograms draw attention, and other cameraless images, I'll just use the word photograms, draw attention to themselves as image objects rather than being transparent windows by virtue of their unique material presence, indexical quality, their reliance on trace and touch, the maker's hand in many cases, and body, the reference to the light-sensitive material, that they remain, as he puts it, insistently objects in the present. Now, much of this could be said about all photographs, but the photogram in, if you think of photography in its primal state, unmediated by perspectival optics, which is, of course, the key, draws attention to this trace, delivering this promise to get closer to the presence of things. That's another quote. An experience of the impossible, another quote from Jeff, which sounds very Barthian, Lacanian, the real itself, if you like, without the baggage of three-dimensional illusion. But it's also, I think, particularly in its historical contextualisation of a turn of many contemporary artists to quite seemingly antiquated techniques, apart from anything else, a response to digital hyperabundance. And certainly our encounter with the images in the exhibition, with the photo objects, if you like, can't but not be informed by our shared context in this moment in time. And not even Batchen can resist a certain binary, concluding his essay by suggesting that cameraless photographs offer the tactile other to the evanescent digital image by virtue of slowing down our perception of the photographic act and forcing us to look closely at individual images. Even more dramatically, Batchen proposes that cameraless photographs, quote, return photography to a unique handmade craft and away from an automatic subservience to global capitalism and its vast economies of mass production and exploitation. Which is probably the biggest claim you've ever made. I like it. It's a kind of big claim that the handmade craft, It takes us away from subservience to global capitalism and its economies of production and exploitation. I've already alluded to the status of photography in museums, its ambiguous presence as reproducible image and singular object. But we'll do well to also remember that the exhibition of photography in museums, the conventions, particularly in art museums, is relatively recent and always evolving. So MoMA, established the first photography department with Beaumont Newhall in 1940 and set a kind of modernist standard for evenly spaced black and white prints to focus our attention on, on individual works. Occasionally interrupted, however, by such exhibitions as famous exhibitions as the Family of Man, Edward Steichen's kind of foray into mass media-like presentations, borrowing from the language of magazines and cinema, heavily informed by Bauhaus designer Herbert Bayer, who he wanted to work with but ended up working with Paul Rudolph. And in the Australian context, just to talk about the recent conventions, the first photography department, I'm doing some research on this, so this is why I'm putting this in here. The first photography department in Australia was set up nearly 50 years ago, 1967, eventually devoting a space to the display of photography. Quite a hard-fought sort of battle that was on a balcony. But in 2013, in 2003, when the NGV moved to, renovated its NGV St Kilda spaces, a space was given to photography, a sort of dedicated space for photography at NGV International. And it was there for 10 years. But in 2013, it sort of disappeared. There was a change of directorship and so on, without controversy, interestingly. Unlike the prints and drawings galleries, which were, there was a bit of, people were more upset about that, it seemed, as photography and other media were integrated into the general hang. Obviously, there was a sense that photography is now part of contemporary art and, it could all be integrated. There was a nice kind of sweet sort of irony in a way when the first artist to exhibit in the former photography gallery was Patrick Pound as part of was this part of Melbourne Now? Yes, yeah, thank you for reminding me, Serena, who works at the NGV. And it was called the Gallery of Air. Of course, the New Zealand-born, Melbourne-based artist Patrick Pound. And it was described as a poetic site-specific installation comprising 91 works from the collection of the NGV and 286 works from the collection of the artist. So what it did is take a lot of objects and images and things that the artist found a reference to air. It was very humorous and witty and made one look at things in very different ways than what the dominant reading of them is. It included a wide range of media, but was underpinned really by Pound's broader practice, which has tended in recent years, particularly, to use found photography, as a kind of strange ordering system, which is not so uncommon. Finding patterns in found photography. So this is his series Portrait of the Wind. Photographs that sort of somehow include the wind, a tie being blown. And it included images from this. There were a number of other sort of small ironies about Patrick Pound's being in the show. I'm not going to linger because I thought Jeff might talk about Patrick, but one of the simple things his work underlines is that in the use of found photography, of course, is that photography's meaning, especially in the absence of captions, in the absence of intentions of the original photographer, is context dependent. We know that. It's not a new insight. But it's a far less controversial insight, perhaps, than maybe it once was. Looking back, this is quite a different context, but when John Sarkowski, again, at MoMA, I should have had the date here, I think it's 1973, or was it 74, 73, presented an exhibition called From the Picture Press, which is one of his more unusual curatorial efforts. It began originally with Diane Arbus. He gathered news photographs and exhibited them without their captions. That was the kind of conceit of the show. And so effectively it just reduced image content to a celebration of sort of formal photographic values. And he was hounded for its, and still is in some context, for sort of its ahistorical decontextualisation of, I mean, obviously of news photographs, so they're a bit different to found snapshots. But artists, of course, thankfully, can often get away with more than curators. So when the Californian artists Larry Sultan and Mike Mandel made their famous work Evidence, which was a book but also an exhibition, most famously as a book, they simply removed all captions and other information about documentary photographs that they'd sourced from archives of corporate, scientific, government and law enforcement agencies that had been used to document procedures and tests. It's probably from one image a bit hard to get a full sense of this, but they are often quite absurdist. But again, the conceit is to present photographs out of context to show how visually ambiguous evidence can be in the absence of captions, and to produce what they referred to as a kind of visual novel. And what, of course, it does is force viewers to come up with their own kind of interpretation, their own meaning. They did get some criticism for, quote, indulging in poetics. But what the work did was, among other things, was really relocate the notion of agency or meaning to the space of presentation and the viewer. So it's seen as very much a sort of precursor to what came after postmodernism and so on. But this idea of transferring, the space of meaning, if you like, to the viewer, you could say that this is very much how photography now seems to operate, especially in the museum, in the sense that curators and artists are now very conscious of, well, particularly curators working with historical collections. I don't know Athol McCready, but I know you've done some work on this, working with historical collections, the kind of renewed, I think that's a quote from one of your essays, the renewed fresh sense of meaning that can be given, for example, to colonial photographs of Indigenous people viewed in very different moment and context by contemporary Indigenous viewers. So there's this kind of realisation that historical photographs, the promise of this kind of record from another time and place, in fact, also inevitably the meaning dwells in the field of a given viewer's perception and knowledge, and that this can be a source for creative curating. In a sense, it's to appreciate that the photograph is an event that unfolds with each encounter. This idea of the event I'm borrowing from Ariella Azoulay, but I'm not going to elaborate. But, okay, to come to my original premise, how are museums and galleries specifically responding to digital hyperabundance? Curators are led by artists, of course, also they will tell you, and in some cases, this is a topic that Jeff is going to pick up, artists are doing their job for them in some ways, in their engagement, particularly with aggregations of images. A lot of contemporary photographic practice begins with someone else's pictures. Not so much as in postmodernism, say, of Richard Prince and others, to sort of appropriate media images in some way to critique maybe, but to take advantage of the kind of exuberance of repositories. And this extends in various directions, from Zoe Leonard's grids of postcards of Niagara Falls. I mean, again, working with collections of postcards is not new. Susan Hiller did it, of course, in the 70s with her Rough Seas work. Rough Seas, yeah. But this is really, I think, it has to be seen as kind of enabled by online searching, purchasing. These haven't been collected methodically over years from thrift shops. These have been purchased online. So in a sense, it does reflect digital culture. But it also extends, this kind of aggregation work extends to, work you probably know, aggregations of Google Street View images or Flickr images and so on. The photographer here then is cast in the role of editor-curator, in some way fulfilling Fred Richan, the New York photo critic's desire for what he calls meta-photographers who can make sense of the billions of images being made today. And such artists working in this way often continue to return to the materiality of images I mentioned earlier, sometimes to the point of refusing the image itself, interestingly. So in 2009, visiting Chicago, I was very struck by, I really liked this display of photographs by an artist I didn't know at the time, Jason Lazarus, who's in your book. Yeah, but with a different work, obviously, at the Art Institute of Chicago, in which only the backs of snapshots were visible in order to show the handwritten inscriptions on the back, the title of the work being one of them. The photographs span the entire 20th century, the Kodak era, let's say, up to the threshold of the digital moment. Abandoned, rediscovered, multiplied, such that they're evoking different kind of histories and narratives, and very elegiac, linking photography to lived experience. Becoming, in this way, the reproducible snapshot, a unique museum object-based installation through the assemblage by the artist. I experienced a similarly elegiac, but more violent, I think, work at Paris Photo, a big photo fair thing in Paris in 2014, which is a wall-based installation of found images by French artist Laurent Pernaut that he'd chemically and systematically erased to the point of near complete whiteness, with a very peculiar quote from Hannah Arendt as the title, which we won't go into. More directly confronting the digital era, and perhaps the most famous, the signature installation of our hyperabundance, and I think Jeff will probably talk about this too, is Eric Kessel's, the Dutch designer and photographer who was commissioned in 2011 at Foam Photography Museum in Amsterdam to respond to the idea of the future of the photography museum. Among other, there were invited curators and so on from around the world, and he did this amazing thing where he printed out 24 hours worth of photos from Flickr, and obviously giving the virtual world a very physical presence and inviting people to actually kneel down and lie down and rummage through the pictures. So here, of course, there's photographs of the objects, but they're the antithesis of precious objects. He said he was seeking to reproduce the feeling of drowning in representations of other people's experiences. And sometimes this has been compared also to kind of pile of rubbish, detritus, the excess. Kessel's is a kind of sentimentalist, I would say, like so many people drawn to found photography, perhaps like so many people drawn to photography, as demonstrated in his more recent exhibition and publication called Shining in Absence, in which in fact contained no photographs, just evoked the space left behind by a photo album where photographs used to be. The experience of viewing this in a museum, of course, is very different to in a photo album, but nevertheless they do produce distinct embodied conditions of viewing. Okay, I'm going to speed up because I'm going over time. Now, since the rise of photo sharing, some museums and galleries have begun flirting with gestures of participatory engagement. An exhibition called How We Are, the first photographic exhibition actually at the Tate in 2007, included an interactive element which was called How We Are Now, and it was on screens in the entrance hall. But the initiative didn't actually come from the curators, Val Williams and Susan Bright, but rather the Tate's marketing department, who created a Flickr group for people to upload photographs, which were then judged, basically to draw in audiences to engage. The Musée de Lycée in Lucerne, Switzerland, quite presciently claimed in their interactive exhibition from 2007 that we're all photographers now. And they solicited submissions from around the world, and each week 100 were chosen at random by a computer and printed out, and then shown on the museum for a week. All photos were then included into the permanent archive of the museum. So this is a curiously kind of democratic gesture and mix of the digital and analogue. Back in London, you may know of the experiments at the Photographers Gallery that, when it reopened in 2012, relocated just off Oxford Street. It appointed a new digital curator and included a new wall, a media wall, which is described as a research program exploring issues concerning the digital image, its dissemination and display. The program includes commissions, collaborations, participation with audiences, but also commissions with artists. But as its location in the foyer beside the cafe implies, it's both central but marginal, in a way, to the main activity of the Photographers Gallery. Finally, I want to finish by thinking about an exhibition on show at the moment that maybe Simone Douglas you've seen, at the International Centre of Photography in New York, which has just opened in its new space in the Bowery, having relocated from Midtown Manhattan and prior to that uptown. They present themselves now, the ICP, as having expanded their mission to engage with photography and visual culture. And its all-glass facade is intended to draw foot traffic into a very visible public space on the ground, intended for talks and events. The first exhibition, Public Private Secret, by curator-in-residence Charlotte Cotton, explores the way in which self-identity is entwined with public visibility and positions itself directly against conventional museum displays. It's received, predictably, a very mixed response. The whole thing, in a sense, functions as a kind of installation. Visitors confront their reflections in mirrored partitions meant to suggest our selfie culture. There's CCTV documenting museum goers with live feeds of pixelated patterns on the wall. Cotton, the curator, I'll come back to this. Cotton, the curator, refers to the layer of images as a constellation, proposing that the coming together into a physical experience of space has to be an experience that you don't want to miss. So clearly this is about getting people to physically attend. It's contrary to the idea that an exhibition might slow down the act of seeing, in general, by the sounds, and embraces the intensity of our experience economy, in many ways replicating that experience of acceleration. It even includes a, by all accounts, visually unrewarding set of screens showing curated real-time streams of imagery based on hashtagged JPEGs, which are not being done by a curator or an artist, but by a tech entrepreneur. Software. Ensuring in the process that no two people will have the same experience of the exhibition. Which, this idea of each experience is kind of unique, is arguably a kind of neoliberal logic of the consumer, but we'll come to that. I'm going to finish. It goes without saying, I haven't seen this exhibition or experienced it, if that might be the better word. I've seen many of the works in the show in previous forms, both physically and online, but like many people, I only experienced this exhibition by documentation, press releases, second-hand accounts. This, even though it's contrary to the kind of logic of the show, nevertheless, still, the discussion about the show offers a very interesting a space for analysis of the assumptions that accompany photography curating and museums, and the dilemma of how to best show images that are no longer simply prints on the wall, although there are some. I mentioned this is the executive director of the museum. I just want to show you a few sort of headlines from very recent, in the last month, newspaper articles. You can see this sort of references to selfies, Insta world, this critic, Jason Farago, is very critical. Says the show merely aggregates rather than doing the curatorial work of juxtaposition, making visual argument. He says it turns its back on art history. And I'll just read you a little quote, I know I'm out of time. The role of the 21st Century Photo Museum, he says, should be to analyse, synthesise and historicise our understanding of today's dispensation of images rather than replicate the products of search engines. A museum must be so much more than an aggregator, more than a collection of JPEGs to be fleetingly contemplative. Of course, it's very hard to disagree with that desire to historically analyse, synthesise and so on. Yet I think we should applaud ICP's experimentation, not least because of the debates it's inspired, that of course are still playing out, because the exhibition helps raise questions about not only about photographies but also the museum's identity. Such an exhibition underlines the fact that artists working with photography are increasingly engaged in staging their own viewing conditions. So I believe this is an interesting moment for photography in the museum or gallery, since it requires curators to reckon with all of the assumptions of conventional modernist modes of spectatorship. Thank you very much.
Even though Dr. Professor Jeffrey Batcham is in just a few feet away, Emanations, which Jeffrey has curated, a group of people that had a hand in its hang, obviously its commissioning, seems to me, as a museum professional, to be a reinvestment in the modern, or a modernist approach to the photograph as you've typified it there, because it's spaced out. It's obviously low lit because of the historical material, only 5 candles, 50-NC lumen. Does this take away from, given that we're a contemporary art museum and our mission is therefore to complicate the contemporary, where in fact we've taken therefore a step back into the modernist spectacle?
Yeah, I don't really see it as modernist, and I doubt Jeff would either, in the sense that when I think of modernist, I do think of the tradition in photography of sort of optical description. So in a way, photograms are already a bit outside that, and but in its emphasis on experimentation and so on, the work and its self-reflexive kind of experimentation and materials and so on. Yes, I would say modernist, but I think you're talking about the way it's presented.
The way it's
the way it's presented.
Yeah.
So let's focus on the way it's presented.
Yes.
Look, I'd love, but I'm sure Jeff would too, if a lot of the images were not behind glass in frames, and maybe weren't so evenly spaced or something, if that's what you're talking about. So in some ways, some parts of the show do have, some quite conventional display. But I think that's just, that is one of the restrictions of working with precious objects, isn't it? That, there's certain requirements. There are moments in the exhibition, I've only seen it for 1 hour this morning. For instance, Anne Noble, Anne Noble's big hanging colour. There are works that are, for instance, not behind glass, that if they'd been presented in the 50s or 60s, that might have been seen as pretty radical.
Yeah.
It's a very contemporary form of presentation. Also, I think I'll end there. Did you want to?
No. I think the exhibition makes, it was a happy coincidence. There's a major exhibition at Te Papa by Athol at the same moment, so it seems there's a deliberate institutional and museological reinvestment or investment in the status of the photograph involved in these two exhibitions.
Yeah,
when,
I'm sorry, I'd
as you say,
love to get down to Wellington.
the stripping away of the space at the NGV with little or no protest, and the ironical re-emergence of Patrick Pound in that space means
The
that
further irony that I did, since I've now got time to, the bits I cut out of my talk, at that time, Patrick had not been collected by the NGV because his work it couldn't sort of fit into the sort of parameters of the photography department, because it was sort of, was it photography? You know, he's working with other people's. So it was kind of another delicious sort of irony that his work was a bit aberrant to the sort of museological conventions.
Yeah. So it seems that we're deliberately doing this, but as a strategy for elevating the status of this, corpus within contemporary art, even if, and one of the strategies for doing that, Jeff is telling a story with a historical ambit, as a chronology, but there's a sense in which the most contemporary of the work, Roof, Markley, Beshti, Varga, strengthens the apposite nature of the oldest work and vice versa. Because, people understand the old as precious.
Yes, yeah. I mean, for me, it's just a more simple sort of thing of why would you want to go to see photographs in physical space when we can, books are arguably, maybe the nicest way to see a lot of photography, but not all photography. And also online is pretty good for a lot of photography, but again, not all. So here you've got a situation where a lot of these are unique, and I said they're behind glass. And lots of times you do have the opportunity to see the kind of objectness of the unique thing. You can see the side there, sort of floating or whatever. And you mentioned the contemporary artists there. Roof's gigantic, picture. It actually doesn't interest me that much, but it's I find it a bit, overly self-important. But the Beshti is great. You can really see the folds and so on.
I've just seen Waleed's huge show at Galerie Eva Pressenhuber in Zurich. And it's the same logic, but like the ones that you showed with the cubes on the floor, they're massive. So is that therefore less compelling to you?
Sorry, why would it be?
Well, if Roof is like overwhelming, when Waleed makes a photo 10 times the size, is that equally as?
Well, I haven't seen it, so it's a bit hard to say how I would respond to it. But I'm probably a bit biased against Roof because I heard him speak not so long ago, and I thought he didn't make much sense. Look, I know that the way I talk might have given the impression that I was opposed to photo objects, opposed to scale, and I didn't want to give that impression, and that everything now should be some sort of experimentation with digital images. I realise that's how the talk could come across. I'm certainly not advocating that.
I happen to have been dealing with Jeff Wall when Stella Brass's essay came out in New Left Review.
Yeah.
And I was trying to borrow Jeff's AP of cleaning the Vanderoe Pavilion, which resides with the Tate, and the Tate wouldn't let us have it at short notice. But he hit Roof over that essay.
That's interesting.
Like, and who are you going to have writing for the publication? And I said, well, I just read that pretty interesting.
You mentioned it.
I said, I've read that pretty interesting essay by Stella Brass in the current. And he went. It was like 20-minute mad rant.
That would have been interesting.
On that.
Yeah.
Though we wanted to there's an external light box. With in the end, it's got Len Lai's Anthea on it. And we'd asked Sugimoto whether we could use his lightning photo because it would have looked really good, silver and black. And Sugimoto came back to us saying, no, you can't use it for a light box. I'm not Jeff Wall. It's pretty funny. I'm curious, if I download a digital picture, a historical photograph,
Yeah.
and sort of print it out and stick it on my fridge, where I know that there's an original, so which I've done recently, just because it's the portrait of one of my forefathers, which I saw in a book, and I got from the author of the essay. She sent me a digital file,
Right.
just so I could print it out and put it on the fridge and say, well, that's your great-great-grandfather, whatever, and I know there's an original. What status does the object that I've printed out have? Does it depend on the original?
What you mean by original there?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I know that in the Alexander Turnbull Library in Wellington, there is a photo from 1863, a portrait of this person.
Yeah.
And I'll probably never get the gumption up to go and look at it, because I have to request them.
Okay.
But
yeah.
I quite liked the photo, so,
What status does it have?
Well, I wonder, is there a difference between the status of those two things?
Well,
or are they the
that
same
I think
thing?
actually is part of an older argument maybe about the vintage print. This sort of idea that the original is the one produced by the artist or something, or the photographer closer to the time of the negative. And actually, again, Jeff's written extensively about that topic, where, in photoculture we tend to privilege the date of the print, the negative is kind of... but I think it gathers meaning according to your experience and use of it. What to me that raises, just back to the museum and gallery, it does raise an interesting issue though, which is actually one that is kind of boring, about one of the things that museums and galleries have difficulties with, which is this, I did mention copyright, that Stalabras mentioned, which is that, wouldn't it be wonderful if galleries and museums could be a bit more playful with the history of, say, photography?
Yeah.
But of course, so much imagery is under copyright. And in some cases that's good and useful because it protects artists and gives them an income and so on. But a lot of the times it's protecting vested interests in institutions. Getty or whoever, Corbis or something. So that is a real problem, I think, actually, for the way that galleries and museums can explore the history of photography in today. I mean, it sort of restricts, and maybe online is a freer space for that, just in the sense that I mean, I haven't really thought that through, but
Well, I guess there is, but there is a sense in which, for an exhibition, potentially we could have a link on our website, scrolling through material that we couldn't otherwise bring for all the reasons of that, but we'd still need appropriate permissions. But,
well, you've got the book,
But we've got the book.
And the problem with websites, of course, is we look at websites all day long. We know it's not like
then
a
there's
special
no
experience.
investment.
That's right. Yeah.
Any questions from the floor, particularly for Daniel?
Very interesting.
Please just say your name.
I might start.
Thanks.
I'm Chloe. I'm just wondering, do you think there are some artists that are rebelling against the reproducibility of the photograph? Some photographers, and maybe photographers like Sugimoto, who you do have to work very hard to apply for permissions to reproduce his works in certain ways. And I'm wondering if that is tied with, this saturation of the image, and it's so easy to reproduce. Some photographers maybe want to rebel against that because they don't want to see their work plastered everywhere. It still needs to be special, I guess.
I can't think too close. I mean, I always find that quite odd, actually. I know that, for instance, in Australia, the artist Rosemary Lang is quite restrictive on how her images are used, and I've always found that quite odd, because I would have thought, an artist tends to like, the promotion of their work in one way or another. You're talking about you're not talking about the production of work, in the way that the work is produced. You're talking about the restriction on
Yeah.
its circulation.
And perhaps wanting
Later.
to keep
Yeah.
the photograph can be reproduced, but
Yeah.
perhaps by some artists they want to keep that for exhibition, keep it being a physical object. And
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, I actually, when I think of that, I think of someone, more like someone like Tino Segal, who does performance work, and prohibits the documentation of them, which is an interesting thing. He's become, quite famous. Of course, people do then try to take photos, and but yeah, the restriction of circulation is an interesting, and actually, I mean, that's an issue broader than art. When people find themselves plastered or their children or something, in the wrong content, and then try to remove it from, say, online, and that becomes incredibly difficult. It's an interesting, and certain artists have actually started to play with that, to try to. I can't remember the name of this artist who basically was manipulating Wikipedia and putting his images up there, and trying to play with this sort of the circulation of images online. But yeah, it's interesting. I mean, maybe others can think of people restricting the circulation.
Thank you, Chloe. I was interested that you referred to the decision by the National Gallery of Victoria to do away with, you might say, medium-specific spaces, in particular photography, prints and drawings. And I'm just wondering what you thought about that, because in some ways there's a few things about it. In some ways it means the NGV as a total museum is adopting the curse of the contemporary. That is an era in which very few artists are actually medium-specific. Even Gerhard Richter makes both paintings and photographs and sculptures.
Yeah.
And most artists think of themselves now as artists rather than as painters or photographers. So, okay, the museum adopts that. And even historically, I mean, Man Ray was a painter as well as a photographer. Charles Negre was a painter as well as a photographer. So, on the other hand, the loss of medium-specific spaces and medium-specific curating. So the question is that a loss? So I'm just wondering what you think about that, because indeed I know from anecdote, a lot of museums around the world are considering this proposition, that is that we should no longer have medium-specific curators and medium-specific spaces in our museums. Is this a positive step or a retrograde one?
Well, there's a few questions there, and thank you for asking. I think, firstly, with the NGV, my response was very much sort of tempered by the fact that I hated the space that existed for photography. It was this awful sort of semicircular space, upstairs on the third floor at the NGV. So I didn't mourn the loss of that space. I think we have to separate spaces and curators, because in general, like you probably, I suspect, as someone invested in the history of photography, I do actually feel sad about dedicated spaces not being available for a couple of reasons. I mean, one, because I feel that there is a distinctive history, that isn't just art, and a lot of the stuff so there's a way to think about those broader histories. Obviously, most of what's there now is art, but the history of it is not. My other concern is that the idea that, you insert photography into the history of art, which of course is what, say, the Tate Modern are doing, it seems to be working there. But I think, because I just always think photography is often very much still on a sort of second tier. So it misses out. It doesn't actually play. It's sort of, maybe there's a bit there. You might get the kind of key names that, the Man Ray or something, but nowhere near enough is done or that could be done. Obviously, Tate Modern's an interesting example because they've just built up their collection from scratch with Simon Baker. But so in some ways, I think, okay, there's an opportunity to do very interesting things by having photographs. But I do think the expertise, so that the spaces is one thing, the expertise of curators, staff, departments, I think, is absolutely
I know we've
still
run out of time,
important.
but I mean, it's striking, don't you think, Daniel, though, that since they lost the space, however inadequate it might have been, there have been no photo shows at the NGV. The Kruger show was, Isabel's Kruger show was the last substantial photography show to be held there. You lose territory, you lose,
Well, that's right.
you lose
But you've also
face time.
lost staff because Isabel Crombie has become the deputy director of the NGV and hasn't been replaced. No senior curator's been appointed. So I think, for example, Maggie Finch has been doing very interesting work to the best of her ability. And so she has done some interesting shows based on photography. The Robert Rooney, I can't remember that name of that show, but that was very interesting 70s conceptual sort of show. But look, I agree. I think without the staff and expertise.
Zara?
Yes,
Okay.
this is last
Zara.
one from Zara.
It's an ethical dilemma. It's the director.
Thanks, Daniel. That was very engaging paper and it brought up lots of ideas and questions. One thing working inside the museum here, there's recently been an episode, we could call it, that touches on that question of copyright and reproductions and the museum's responsibility. And as you said, increasingly around the world, museums are very much having an open photography
Oh, yeah.
policy,
That's another thing.
because basically you can't control people coming in and shooting objects that are in the museum anyway on their phones. But in New Zealand, a couple of weeks ago, there was an incident, I guess, that has caused us to question that in a very deep way. And rather than sort of go to the opportunity for marketing and promotion through seeing images going out there in Instagram, what happened was actually that photographs of, or images of portraits of Maori were found on items like shower curtains being sold in America and other places. And when this was identified, of course, there was outrage of people seeing their ancestors on household items, cups and other things. And so immediately the question is raised with the museum, what are you doing about this? How are you protecting our ancestors' images which are in the museum, which may not have been on those items, because those items could have been taken from a great reproduction in a book, photographed and put onto some object. So there's a sort of re-questioning now of photography, particularly inside museums such as ours, which hold that type of visual material. I just wanted to raise that as a point touching on something that you had addressed. But also I thought your paper was great in bringing up that question about audiences and their behaviour and expectations, because on one hand, you touched on the fact that do people want the slowed down experience of seeing the single item object, which we've been talking about here in Emanations, or do they want something that perhaps in a sense touches on reality and that overlapping aggregation, saturation that we have every day? Or is that something that we expect when we come to a museum that we have a different perspective on, a critical one, or a different way of experiencing reality? And I think you brought up that tension about what is it that museums can offer that audiences also desire in around those questions of the real, and also what the museum can do in a critical perspective dealing with the real.
Thanks, Sarah. Is there a question there?
Well, really it was,
Yeah.
do you see that that direction's going one way or another? Maybe we're seeing museums which are trying to investigate the aggregation, and
Yeah.
we're also seeing exhibitions which are
Yeah.
going in the opposite
Yeah.
direction. So
Yeah, I don't
is that
think
a
it's
current situation of
Yeah,
tension?
I don't think it's a choice of one or the other. I think probably different audiences want different things, and maybe one person might want both at different times. And so it's not a case of one being better than the other. It's a case of being conscious and open to different kinds of, rather than just, the assumption is it has to be one way or the other. That's why I celebrate what ICP are doing, just because it is kind of so sort of out there. In terms of the restriction, the issue of Maori images, portraits, yes, that is an instance where the sort of prohibition of circulation actually does come up, but it's not contemporary artists so much as, yes, images that people don't want others to see, open to open archives and state library for reasons of cultural sensitivity, which of course I respect. I think it's very, very difficult because as you said, they could come from other contexts like books, or very difficult. It's a bit, I don't have a clear answer for that, but I think it's you know, you just would hope that people could be, you know, even if they're going to, you know, appropriate to respect, you know, it's a bit, I guess, I think of sort of free speech, you know, which of course is never free, and but you know, there's a limit, you know. So obviously, you know, we have to allow people to offend one another, but we don't want to incite violence. You know, that's like kind of that, you know, where you don't want to be too policing. I tend to want to be quite, you know, I'm sort of generally opposed to copyright for partly because I think in the context of digital imaging, it only serves vested interest rather than, say, artists.